So we are delighted to invite you all on behalf of AIT Extension, CFOL Center in collaboration of IDRC and Gender and Force Migration Center, AIT. Let's together invite our today's speaker, Professor Paula Banerjee, the IDRC Chair, Gender and Development Studies, AIT, and the Director of Center for Gender and Force Displacement, AIT. With this honor, may I invite our Executive Director of AIT Extension for opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Shaheen Hussain. Good morning, Dr. Paula, and good morning from Thailand, everyone, every participant, the audience this morning. Today's sessions, online sessions, I consider as the gender and climate action that AIT will also organize in Bangkok next 2 days, 24th of November, 24th of October. So this is a good opportunity for us to really explore the matters that relate to the gender perspective, the climate change, and also forced migration. So if you notice on the screen that Professor Paula is sitting, we have displayed 3 SDG indicators. I think that is the minimum indicator of SDGs, which is very important. Number 1 is the SDG 5, which is related directly to the gender, and also, of course, we also have a SDG that related to climate change, but we have not put there. The second one is about the reducing inequalities, which is SDG 10. That also this consortium and also expert of AIT and the institute is trying to address in the next 5 to 7 years to come for 2030. And last but not the least is SDG 16 in terms of the institutional strengthening, and gender is one of the very effective, very important, very critical components of the partnership, and also in terms of the institutional strengthening. I also believe that the session this morning will brought us, a kind of perspectives of how to really look at the genders into the climate change and climate challenges, including the forced migration, where we can really put this jigsaw together. So I would like to thank on behalf of AIT Extensions and also on behalf of the CFOL Center Bangkok to Dr. Paula Banerjee that giving us time and be able to make herself, which is very busy, available for this session this morning. And I wish the audience will benefit from these sessions, because this is a big issue, and this is the issue that is not easy to deal with. So we have to break down these things into different things where we can make sense in the future. So I wish you enjoy the sessions, and feel free to write to us. Feel free to write to Dr. Paula if you have any questions today or maybe later on, so that we can address your interest in the gender area accordingly. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Boravet Chonlachi, the Executive Director of AIT Extension, AIT. Now, let's together introduce Professor Paula Banerjee. Actually, it is very tough to introduce Professor Paula Banerjee, because she is a global scholar, known everyone as I know. So, and her expertise in gender and migration, displacement is huge, and that makes a break event sounds to the global citizen, global scholars as well. So also just for some information about her, she is the professor, she is the former VC, she is the former dean, she is the president and respectively for University of Calcutta, Sanskrit College and University, IASFM, MCRG, Foreign Policy Studies, as well as editor of Refugee Watch. So you are well concerned that she is global scholar, and we are honored to be part of this event and to get her valuable time for this webinar. And the objective of this webinar to disseminate the knowledge, definitely, and to reach out the people, interact with the people for their needs, for their higher study, for their capacity building training and research and other aspects. Please feel free to contact with us for any aspects. So now I would like to invite Professor Paula Banerjee for her speech. Ma'am, please.
Thank you so much, Shaheen. And a big thanks to Mr. Voravota Chonlasen. He's been always very supportive of initiatives related to the SDGs, particularly SDG 5. And from my center, that is collaborating in this Center on Gender and Forced Displacements, I wish you all a very warm welcome. And those of you who are joining us from Bangkok, I will invite you to our Climate Action Day program in Hotel Ambassador at 10 o'clock on the 24th of October this month. So this is a precursor to that seminar that we will have on the 24th of October. Now, the topic for today is climate change, its effects on gender, and how that affects the whole question of displacement. I have a secret for you all. Capitalism and fossil fuel industry are causing the climate change. Wait, it is not a secret? Then why are governments, private institutions, and multinational companies still investing billions of dollars in the very industry that's causing the suffering of billions of people around the world? Although I've been saying it and acting it out, but it is not my saying. It is said by Mitzi Jonel Tan, a Filipino activist, climate activist. So she, in very simple language, has told us what is the crux of the problem. We often hear words like climate change. What does it actually mean for gender activists like me in simple, very simple languages? All of us know what greenhouse gases are. Now, greenhouse gases are not something which is created out of any natural situation. Greenhouse gases actually are produced, so that we do our everyday activities while we do our everyday activities. So these greenhouse gases, we all know some of the names. For example, carbon dioxide. Now, carbon dioxide, as we know, is a very important gas, and it is very important for plants. However, too much of production of carbon dioxide creates greenhouse gases. The other is methane, then there is nitrous oxides, and there are many, many other gases. It's not just three. But these things, these gases are produced for very simple activities. Agriculture produces it, road construction produces it, industries produce it in high quantities, deforestation results in these gases. See, we willy-nilly cut trees for the timber, but we don't realize that the cost of cutting timber is so very high. So, these gases are very essential in certain activities, but if you use them or produce them in very high quality, then it creates enormous problems for the world. Now, I've written one of the reasons as changes in the Earth's orbit and its axis of rotation. Okay, just read that part. I'm not going to explain it. I'm not a scientist. That is not my core competence area. But scientists and specialists cite that. So I have cited it. This is slide number 2, climate change. I will tell you very simply, between 1890 and 2010, the temperature of the world had gone up by just 0.1 centigrade. However, now in 10 years' time, we are seeing that the temperature is going up in tremendous manner. The world knows, we have all heard that if the temperature goes up by 2 degrees centigrade, then it can be catastrophic. Right now, as a result of the Sustainable Development Goals and as a result of climate activism, we can say that we have brought down the 2 degrees to 1.5 degrees now. Changes will happen 1.5 degrees. Even that is catastrophic. So we have to take action so that climate change does not destroy the planet. What are the effects of climate change? We all talk about sea levels rising and oceans becoming warmer. Tremendous amount of fishes are extinct now because of the increase in temperature in the seas. Because of this unnatural warming, there are a number of marine life that we are losing. Other than that, we have intense periods of drought in the part of the world that I come from. It is said that by the next 10 to 20 years, 34 million people will lose their jobs, particularly in agriculture, due to the effects of climate change. And believe it or not, the majority of these 34 million will be women. So let us talk a little bit about the effects of climate change. Then I will come to how it affects women, children, LGBTQ community, old, physically challenged, all the people who are otherwise considered as vulnerable and marginalized population. So you can see a poor polar bear standing all by itself and looking at the glacier, which is fast disappearing. Where will they live? Then Arctic, marine turtles are almost becoming extinct now. Diversity of life is changing as a result of climate change. So we have to think about that. We have been talking about underwater warming, marine life, etc. But climate change has serious human costs. Natural disasters and environmental degradation, loss of biodiversity, all of these devastate agriculture. So in South Asia, for example, in the last 1 year, we saw that in sowing season, there was tremendous drought. That is when you need water. However, in harvesting times, there were floods. So, ripe crops could not be harvested. They were destroyed because of floods. This cycle of drought and floods is now becoming a regular event in certain parts of the world. And that is affecting food production. And food production, the moment food production gets affected, we're all suffering from the effects of cost rise. So the rich people will get food, but the poor people will not get food. Other than that, it also has dangerous environmental effects and on questions of safe shelter, natural safe shelter. These safe shelters are getting destroyed. But, even though we are constantly talking about these things, what is happening is that people are not getting enough concerned about these things. And so humanitarian actions are falling short of what we need to address. For example, there are a number of industries like tanning industry that pollutes water sources. Our rivers are getting polluted, not just for tanning industry or other kinds of industry like dyes, and all of that, which is dumped in the river, dumped in the ocean. Even simple things like plastic, it is dumped in the ocean. Ultimately, it is dumped in the ocean. So we are not getting water for agriculture, and water sources are getting polluted. There are a lot of waterborne diseases that are affecting us. So, in one word, human costs of climate change is also exceedingly high. Look at this. This will show you the gender concerns for green life and its effects on human beings. Now, one thing I have to, totally bring it out at the beginning, that gender does not translate to women. However, why do we talk about women so much when we talk about gendered events? Simply because women are slightly more than 50% of the population of the earth. Yet, all the paradigms that are created are male-centric. So to make any corrective, we have to bring in questions of women. But that doesn't mean that gender ends with women. Gender is also about men. Gender is about power asymmetry in our lives. So a lot of men from the global south needs more empowerment than many women in the global north, not all women. So you see, when we talk about gender, we often forget that gender is not a binary. It is not just about men and women. There are other genders also who are affected as a result of climate change. The third gender, the LGBTQI, and a lot of other people are affected. Women and children and members of the LGBTQ community, as I told you, are socially much empowered empowered than other groups in society. In terms of power sharing, we have seen that they are less and less in terms of power sharing in the world. Environmental disasters and climate change impact their lives, but the policies about climate change, the policies about environmental disasters are not affected by these people. They do not form the policies. When we have informal meetings on gender and climate change, we will see that just the other day, the ADPC organized a course and I was giving a lecture. In the round table, 90% of the people sitting are women, 10% were men. That was a skewed gender composition. However, if you see the same meeting done in national level or international level, you will see the 90% of the meeting, participants are men, only 10% are women. And we don't even consider the LGBTQ community, because in what way do we find that out about people's sexuality? Now people give their pronouns. Before, even that was in my generation, even that was not considered necessary. So you see, all these people who are not sitting in the high table are actually not affecting policies. So policies are not formed by these people. However, they are having to pay the price in enormous ways. Why? Because it is the women's job to put food on the table. So no matter what disaster we are talking about, to make sure that there's food on the table, and more than 75% of caring responsibilities, caring for children, caring for the infirm, caring for matured people, caring for physically challenged people, all of this work falls in the orbit of women. So that is why we just came through a pandemic. And in that pandemic, now pandemics are also climate related in certain times, at certain as a result of certain vectors. And so, we just came out of the pandemic. We saw how grievously, how seriously the morbidity of women was affected because these women were the people who were responsible for 90% of the caring jobs, if we look at both formal and informal sectors. However, women's sanitation needs are never looked into. For example, let's talk about the migrant laborers, who were being returned in hordes as a result of the pandemic. How many of us really cared about the post-teenage young women who were walking back home, whether they were menstruating or not? They were in serious physical, state because they were menstruating, yet they could not change their sanitary napkins. They could not, some of them were wearing cloth, and that itself was infected. So many of them are even today suffering from UTI and other kinds of diseases. So you see, questions about resources, even when disasters have not struck, questions about resources. Remember the Chipko movement in India, where women went and tied themselves to the trees. They could not afford a deforestation. Their husbands were against them, multinationals were against them, but they went and tied themselves to the trees because they had this symbiotic relationship with nature. Nature gave them production so that they could enhance their status. However, nature was being taken away from them, so they protested. So women are in large numbers in environmental movement. When we talk about climate change, whose face comes before us primarily? Of course, a young woman called Greta Thunberg. Again, woman, when we talk about dam movements, whose faces come up before us? So, all of these, for example, in Indian dam movement, it's Medha Patkar. Why do women in such numbers participate? And why do men also get seriously affected as a result of climate change? Because it has impact on all genders. And gender here is a signifier of power relationship. The more you are down in the power scale, the more you will be affected as a result of climate change. Now, to understand what are the international policies on climate change, we have to talk about at least two, one agreement and one protocol. The Paris Agreement, I kept this before because Paris Agreement has serious impacts, very, very serious impacts. So I talk about the Paris Agreement and then the Kyoto Protocol. EU Green Deal, I will not deal with that too much, but I will deal with Paris Agreement and the Kyoto Protocol. However, I will go on the basis of, chronologically, Kyoto Protocol and its impact on gender. Gender equality continues to be increasingly recognized as a critical cross-cutting issue in all environmental agreements. In 1992, Chapter 24 of the Kyoto Protocol stated women have considerable knowledge and experiences in managing and conserving natural resources. In 2013, many legal instruments and norm-setting agreements integrating texts that promote gender equality and gender rights were forwarded. From the preamble and shared vision text to actionable language for programs and finance, this language recognized the integration of women's rights and gender equality in the whole notion of climate change, biodiversity, desertification, etc. So because women have this intrinsic relationship, I told you, the symbiotic relationship with nature, the Kyoto Protocol agreed that women had specialized knowledge about nature, and that does not affect in the harnessing of nature. We should not harness nature. We should adopt ourselves to live with it. And so that is why Kyoto Protocol is very, very important, because it talks about how women have specialized knowledge of nature. Paris Agreement, look at the preamble. That climate change is a common concern of humankind. Parties should, when taking action, to address climate change, respect, promote, and consider their respective obligations on human rights, the right to health. This is very important. We do not often recognize women's right to health. Okay. The rights of indigenous people. Here again, I have to flag that indigenous people have enormous knowledge, the First Nations, enormous knowledge about climate action, yet they are hardly ever consulted. We hardly ever take into account, this population where, and use their indigenous knowledge on this. And that is very, very important. They also lose resources as a result of trying to harness nature and by exploiting nature. Local communities, migrants, children, persons with disabilities, people in vulnerable situation, and the right to development, as well as gender equality, empowerment women, and intergenerational equality. All of this was in the preamble of Paris Agreement. Now, the principal decision for gender under the convention was enhanced by what was called the Lima Work Program. Those of us who are working on gender should know that the Lima Work Program actually talks about how gender responsive measures and climate policies can be taken. And also, we have to understand that we are looking at policies that needs budget. And this budget is very, very important because we have to make it a gender responsive budget. The Lima Work Program also talks about capacity building on gender and also talks about how adaptation and mitigation can be controlled, or where gender invested ideas can come into being. When we are talking of climate change, there are a couple of terms that we have to understand. One is the term slow onset, the other is sudden onset. So if it's slow onset climate change, then that means it's over a time period. So river water erosion is a slow onset climate change process. Now, policies, international policies can be taken as reactive to that. You can react to slow onset climate change. But if it is sudden onset, like tsunami, like earthquake, like floods, then you cannot be reactive to those policies. You have to be proactive to those policies. You have to plan it. You have to address early warning. You have to take measures even before it happens, because when it happens, you will not be able to react to that. So sudden onset and slow onset are two very important methods of, climate movements. The other thing that we have to understand is that there are a couple of words in our lexicon that needs to be teased out, deconstructed, and addressed. One is resilience. The other is adaptation. And the third is mitigation. The most amount of funding is on mitigation. Mitigation is policies that change, the climate, the climate change that can change it. We can make policies for mitigation. But adaptation is we have to adapt to climate change. That is short-term, adaptation. There can be long-term adaptation, but long-term, we normally think in terms of mitigation. The other is, again, a word that can be used often quite irresponsibly, that is resilience. People need to be resilient. But for resilience, we have to make it an equal playing field. How do people who suffer from malnutrition become resilient? So, when we say, people should increase their resilience, we have to see what is the bottom line with those people. So, all of these impact gender relations within climate change and also impact the nature, the climate itself. The other two words, again, that I will flag is climate vulnerability and disaster. Disaster refers to a serious disruption of the functioning of community, family, society, state, etc., due to any hazardous events that interacts with conditions of exposure, vulnerability, and capacity for human beings to lead a normal life. It affects human, material, economic, and environmental processes and creates losses of these. So, resilience is something that when vulnerability, even though there is vulnerability, but when disaster happens, when people can address the vulnerability and take action to normalize their lives, that is resilience. Why does it matter so much in terms of gender? Because climate change is a threat to everyone. It does not affect everyone equally. So the more vulnerable you are, such as women, such as LGBTQ, such as young people. So you see, young people, both young girls and boys, they are inordinately affected by climate change. Because I told you, food production, suffers. I told you, the temperature suffers, the pollution suffers. So as a result of this, people in their growing period get seriously affected as a result of climate change. Children have blood cancers. Why should they have it? So, however, they actually produce the least amount of pollutant in the environment. So the people who are producing the least amount of pollutants are getting the most affected. And it is the same for women. It is the same for LGBTQ community. They produce less pollutants, mega capital, big industries pollute the maximum. Yet they do not suffer what these people suffer. So that is why this power asymmetry has to be addressed. And addressing it through the lens of gender is an easy process, is an important process, and gender affects the entire population and shows vulnerability. So that is why it is important. So this is especially true in many parts of the world where women rely on climate sensitive work like agriculture and manual labor to make a living. Climate crisis is like every other humanitarian crisis. It has greater impact on women, greater impact on LGBTQ community, greater impact on children. Yet, unequal sharing of power between women and men, the gender gap, their access to education, women's access to education, women's employment opportunities, the unpaid care burden, prevalence of gender-based violence, and other parts of deep-rooted gender-based discrimination makes women more sensitive, more in certain ways, they suffer more as a result of climate change. So they produce less pollutants, they affect the climate process adversely, less adversely, yet they are most affected as a result of that because of power relationship, power paradigms. Now, we have to understand that climate change disasters produce enormous amount of displacement. Let's just remember the Boxing Day tsunami in 2004. It affected the entire South and Southeast Asia. It initially affected countries like Indonesia, Sri Lanka, India, Maldives, Thailand, that sustained massive damages, but its ripple effect affected the entire South and Southeast Asia. Thousands of migrant workers lost their livelihoods. Homes were, removed from the faces of land. The entire ASEAN region lost millions of homes. People lost their jobs, destruction of employment sector. Many people were without money, without food, without shelter. They were completely shorn of any resources for their everyday livelihood. Those who found work were not paid half the time. When they demanded payment, they were removed from their job. And, there are enormous numbers of migrant workers who are not regularized. The regular migrant workers, they are the irregular migrant workers. they were most affected because they were hiding, they were fearing deportation. So even when they were physically affected, and this is particularly true about irregular migrant women. Women were most scared. They did not get access to health care. They did not get access to aid, yet they would not come out of their hiding because then they would be deported. So, there are other problems with these. The other is, Haiyan. Remember the Haiyan that affected Philippines, that affected Malaysia, and all these places in 2013. That also had enormous impact on men and women, particularly women, because, what happens is that women is vested with the job of looking after family, of looking after community. So their morbidity rises. They do not get resources to look after themselves. They do not have that time to look after themselves because they have to give care work to other people. So how do they adopt? When we talk about adaptation, how do women adopt? Because they are constantly running off their feet. So that is why, what are the lessons that we have learned as a result of this? We've learned that climate change affects everybody: women, men, boys and girls, old and young, LGBTQ community, physically challenged migrant workers, indigenous communities. However, it affects different population groups differently. Also, in this, we have to understand that the entrenched and systemic discrimination can lead to gender differentiated impacts of climate change. Already, LGBTQ community, women, physically challenged, they suffer, systemic institutionalized discrimination in society. And that discrimination is also done through the lines of gender. As a result of this, climate change affects these sort of marginalized people, these sort of powerless people, way more than it affects powerful people. Rich people, powerful people move, but the poor, the marginalized get displaced. They do not migrate, they are forcefully made to migrate. Today, in the world, there are millions of people who are facing displacement on the basis of climate, on the basis of war, on the basis of ethnic harassment. They're asked to move, they're facing effects where they have to vacate their lands. Among this population, there are people who would be able to cope with it, and there are other people who would not be able to cope with it because of their intrinsic vulnerability. And this vulnerability comes from discrimination that they have been facing all their lives. So as a result of this, climate change, therefore, will affect everybody. The adverse effects of climate change will affect everybody. So just because you're rich or poor doesn't mean you will not be affected by climate change. But if you are powerless, if you are marginalized, if you are discriminated in the society, you will be affected more. Intersectional forms of discrimination can make women and girls more vulnerable to climate change. When you are displaced, in the basis of your displacement, in your travels, women and girls, 90% of those who are physically abused and harassed or sexually abused are women and girls. Men are also sexually abused, but less. And sexual molestation, sexual harassment takes dirty, ugly forms like rape, like other forms of molestation, and they affect more and more women and children. And today, to hide evidences, these women are also being killed, even in rich countries like United States. Just recently, I was hearing about a case where this young man attacked this teenage girl, and because she refused sexual favor, she was a traveler. She was also moving. She was killed. So travels, movements, mobility brings in certain added risks, added vulnerability for women, for LGBTQ community, for the physically handicapped. And when you are moving because of climate change, then that gets exacerbated. The meaningful and informed participation of women in policy making from local, national, and international level is very, very important, because there is this slogan which is very, very important, and that is nothing about us without us. This is a slogan that women, that LGBTQ community have raised, and our SDGs also bring this forward. Nothing about us without us. So if you believe that your country, your state, your locality need to fight, need to work for SDG 13 and SDG 5, then you have to bring in women. You have to bring in a diverse cross section of people in, decision-making processes, because then only you can be advised by their voices. Indigenous population, you have to bring in the First Nation in the negotiating table for actions on climate change. Otherwise, how would you benefit from all of this? So climate activism and gender is very, very important. It takes ambitious and rights-based climate change slogans and adaptive actions. It ensures meaningful participation of women. We also have to ensure meaningful participation of other groups such as indigenous population, such as LGBTQ community, and we have to take measure so that in UNFCCC, there is enough contribution made by women, that women are there in the table. We have to facilitate that. We have to empower women. Our action as academics, as researchers, is mostly to facilitate and try to empower these groups. The other thing that I haven't really talked about, because I talked about it in my previous lecture here, and that is gender responsive budgeting. In climate change, in climate action funds, in the GCFs, we have to think about the gender climate funds. And so gender responsive budgeting, we have to see from what sources we are getting money for our budget. We have to see where the budget is being spent. So, who are the beneficiaries of that budget? So gender responsive budgeting is very, very important and that is part of taking effective measures and addressing, sexual and gender-based violence in the context of climate change. It promotes the understanding that human rights is impacted by climate change, and human rights also impacts climate change in the long term. So we have to invest our budget in equaling this playing field on the notions of equity. We cannot just spend our budget without understanding the gender impact of that budget. Gender mitigation. I told you about adaptation and mitigation. Now, to take action to mitigate climate change, we have to bring in gender positive impacts. This may be achieved by general nature of mitigation projects or programs, such as clean energy for household lighting or cooking. So many people in South Asia, in Africa, particularly women, gets affected. They get cancers, they get ulcers, they fall sick as a result of using fossil fuel, as a result of using fuel which produces noxious and toxic gases. So, these women have to sit there day after day in front of toxic gases for producing food. So we have to, in our mitigation, consider clean energy. And that is very, very important for household lighting or cooking, because it has enormous impact on gender. For gender equity, we have to start with the local. We have to start with the households. So we have to plan from where revenues will flow in. We have to plan what kind of projects under Kyoto Protocol's flexible mechanism is undertaken, and we have to see the potentially positive impacts that they have on the lives of women by improving types of livelihood that affects positively the health of women. During the pandemic, women were among the marginalized group to get help for their health from the state. So we have to have, programs that even if these women are undocumented migrants, they should be able to access health-related support system in any crisis situation. So mitigation has to start from there. Just because some women are undocumented, states should take measure to make sure that the path of migrant workers is made easier and less expensive so that people can go for documented work. The important thing is, for example, the economies of Southeast Asia, much of it is resting on the activities of migrant workers. People move to places where there's a demand for their labor. They would not just go to places where there is no labor. Nobody starves when they go to their destination country because they work and produce labor. So it is incumbent upon the state, it is easy for the world community to make their journeys accessible and less hazardous, because hazards have impact on climate. Hazards have impact on the earth. Extraction of the earth exhausts the earth and affects climate change adversely. We have to have gender sensitivity in climate action, and we have to stop hazardous extractions. But primarily, we have to believe in climate change. There are climate change deniers. We have to sit them in the table and show them the tangible effects of climate change. How many typhoons are occurring now in such less sort of time period? How many, even in United States, in coastal Florida, how many typhoons, how many, other kind of environmental disasters are happening? Whereas in the coast of Florida, you have flooding. In the coast of California, you have forest fires burning. That is the effect of climate change. We can see the effect of climate change. There is no way of denying that. We have to take action to support SDG 13 that addresses climate change, to support that it is interrelated, that we take action about SDG 5 and empower women, facilitate women for the mitigation processes of climate change. So this is completely interrelated. That is why, to save the earth, we have to take gender sensitive climate in action. Otherwise, when the next pandemic comes, if we do not take gender sensitive action, if we do not take poverty sensitive action, the world will be wiped out. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Paula Banerjee, for your nice presentation, speaking and in-depth briefing about gender, climate change, and displacement. We're really happy to be part of this. So in a summary, if I go through the whole presentation, I could say the audience who participated today learned a lot. Professor Paula Banerjee started with the greenhouse gas effects. She goes through the environmental issues. She goes through the disaster issues, focus highly on gender responsive budgeting, national, international policy, and how adaptation, mitigation, and resilience are performing in this planet. She talks about climate threat. She talks about states measures, hazard. She talks about SDGs 13 and connected with SDG 5. She very deeply focused on power relations and where women are so vulnerable. She not only covered only the women issues, as she said, she also covered all other vulnerable, marginalized people and how it affects through the climate change, by the climate change, and how we can work, how policy maker people, global awareness people should address those issues for next generations, for the survival of future peoples. Overall, she talks about the awareness and where she emphasizes the learning process of people's capacity building, continuous study, because the webinar, lecture, whatever we deliver here for 1 hour may not enough. People need to connect it with learning systems. So she addressed also like how you will be connected or how it will help you connected with the upcoming educations. So overall, from my side, thank you, Professor Paula Banerjee, for your nice presentations and very insightful briefing. So now I would like to draw attention of participants who are honored to be part of these events to share their comments, query, if any. Yeah, we already have one question from Mr. Shamim. As I say, so let's start with this. He asked like, how can we address the intersecting challenges faced by women in global south?
I was saying that this is a huge, huge question. We have to, there are multiple levels where we can take action. There are levels such as the local levels, there are levels such as the national levels, regional, and then international. In all these levels, we have to take actions. And the first action is to try to make the world more equitable, to try to change the vectors there where women are most affected. For example, try to give nutritious food to women, try to educate them. Otherwise, how would you expect them to be resilient? Try to empower them, try to facilitate their education, try to facilitate their training. You may ask me, how does it affect climate? It does affect climate because more informed women will be able to make households more informed, will be able to make communities more informed. And more informed communities means less greenhouse gases, less pollution. In the national and international level, we have to bring women to the negotiating table. We have to bring indigenous population to the negotiating table. Now, often in terms of negotiations, women are disempowered because women's bodies are considered to be polluted. These are the misunderstandings that we have to work against. We have to show that menstruation is not polluting. In fact, menstruation clears the body of pollution. So it is a cleansing effect, if we put it, and only women can cleanse themselves naturally. So, we have to sensitize and bring women, not disempower them, but empower them to come to the negotiating table so that women are the largest peacemakers of the world. Women are the most caring about the sustainability of the earth, the sustainability so that their children can get a sustainable world. So women have to be, because they are invested with, this They are invested with trying to make this a more climate friendly world. So they have to be brought to the negotiating table. And, you know, uh, there is another old slogan that needs to be remembered, and that is we cannot have action if there is no representation. So no taxation without representation was something that the colonies raised, that women raised as a slogan long back. Today, migrant workers who are investing in the economy of their destination places as well as their places of origin needs to be facilitated and empowered so that their problems can be addressed. Unless we address the problems of laboring community, we will not understand what are the vectors of climate change. They have intrinsic knowledge about what pollutants is creating the greenhouse gases, what is making people choke when they're working in long-term polluting industry, what is causing cancer. So unless there is gender responsive budgeting on the international level and use and effective use of people with knowledge and who are marginalized, unless we bring them to the table, we listen to them, we negotiate on the basis of their advice, we will not have a climate friendly world or a more equitable world. So I hope I have addressed some of your questions, but your question is so broad that it would take another lecture to address all the points.
Sorry, I'm curious to know about, like you said about disaster, drought that brings tsunami, flood, and it costs a lot. And you focus on that. In this case, like this, more are vulnerable are women and that old people, kids. So how it bring to the table to the policy or state management system so that they can more aware on this, because awareness is very vital nowadays to bring the issues to concern on this.
Thank you, Shaheen. And I have to thank SM Ghulam Molla, who is the Director of Forestry Science and Technology from Chattogram, Bangladesh. Thank you so much for joining our, webinar. Informed people like you, if you come, then we can have a good discussion, sir. So I'm very happy that you came for today's webinar. And if policymakers like you are there, it is easy for us to understand also the problems related to policy, which is very, very important. And, Shaheen, you have touched upon something very, very important. Today, we have a lot of courses. We organize webinars, we organize, discussions, but are we reaching the people that we need to reach on the basis of this? Because people in the rural community, we cannot just have gender sensitive, gender and climate sensitive discussions in the urban sectors. We normally confine ourselves to cities like Bangkok. Even in Pathum Thani, we don't hold the discussions unless it is online, because we know people will not come here. So what happens to the rural communities? The rural communities are places which are most affected by climate change. So we are, just the way we are thinking of creating clean cities, as a result of which we have, enormous amount of discussions within the cities. We also have to go to the villages. We have to take the knowledge to the villages. Not all discussions need to be in English language. So in villages, these discussions should be undertaken in vernacular languages. So, there's a lot in terms of structure, in terms of modality that we can do to prevent the nefarious effects of climate change. But we often do not do that because, we are so city-centric. More importantly, we are so capital-centric. In India, such a huge city, but we only do major programs in New Delhi. In Thailand, the only places that we do important programs are places like Bangkok, like Chiang Mai. What happens when, effects are so widespread? It is in the villages, in the coastal areas, but we don't take the knowledge to those areas. Like Chattogram, there's an enormous need. Those of us who are fluent, who speak in Bengali, Bengali is our mother tongue. We are not understandable in places like Chattogram, because there they have a different dialect. So we have to work collaborating with these communities, in partnership with these communities, so that knowledge can be transferred to these areas. We have the what we used to call the Deng principles, or the guiding principles of IDPs. When I went to Geneva to talk about IDPs, I brought out the fact that guiding principles are not translated. So how would communities that are displaced know that there are these principles, there are these soft laws that can support them, if we do not have the knowledge? So I was working with, I'm still working with an organization called Calcutta Research Group. And there, the first action we did was to translate the guiding principles into 10 different languages. We have to see if the new amendments of CEDAW, we have to see if the new amendments to the climate change protocols, the new amendments, the new conventions of ILO are transferred in Thai, so that it can be taken to villages in Thailand. That should be a project. These translations should be a project. Gender sensitive, responsive budgeting should give us budget, so that translated budget can be undertaken, translations can be undertaken, so that all genders are made aware of what special program exists for their support, for their health, and where can they partner. So that is what we have to bring in to gender responsive budgeting. We hardly ever talk about knowledge production as part, knowledge production meaning diversity oriented, inclusive knowledge production for gender responsive budgeting. And I think the extension should address gender responsive budgeting. We should try to make aware the donor communities that this is a place where we want to address gender responsive budgeting through vernacular languages. And we cannot just do sensitization in English. We have to do it in multiple languages, languages of the people, because we have to remember nothing about us without us.
Thank you, Professor Paula Banerjee. I think there is one respondent, Professor Sangvida. Thanks you for your insightful presentations. So I think we are ending of our time. Thank you, everyone, for your nice participations, questions, presence, and query as well. Of course, we will share our recording for all the participants or registered people who do registration for this webinar, so that they can get further knowledge for their suitable time, in their suitable time. And at the last moment, once again, I would like to thank Professor Paula Banerjee for her valuable time and sharing a broad sense of knowledge to the global participants. And thank you all the participants here for your registration and contribution of time. And please keep with us in touch for your any support regarding training, research, or higher education. Keep in touch with us. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for today.